Yeah, so I graduated with a civil engineering degree in 1999 from Salford University in the UK, and for the first 3 years of my career, I worked for a heavy civils contractor in the UK. In 2002, I took a role at Arup to assist my professional qualification and get some design experience, and I decided after a year of doing that I really enjoyed the design challenges and the work at Arup, and I made that move permanent in 2003 as a civil engineer in our infrastructure team in Cardiff in the UK. So I worked there through to the level of senior engineer, and in early 2010 I was able to come to California to support our office's work here on the preliminary engineering of the high-speed rail project for California, where we were doing preliminary design for 2 segments. So I initially moved to Los Angeles for 2 years in 2010, and ended up leading the civil team, an evolving civil team that was being put in place in LA when I arrived. And in 2013, a year after I should have gone back to the UK, I'd extended once, and I made the move permanent to the US. So I transferred to Arup in Los Angeles, where I led our civil team, which is a team of 12 to 14 staff, until 2019, when I was then appointed as the deputy infrastructure practice leader for the Los Angeles office. And then in 2020, I was made the permanent infrastructure practice leader in LA. So in my current role, I lead a practice with 30 plus staff, and we are somewhat jointly amalgamated with our San Francisco practice. So we offer a West Coast infrastructure practice. There's a team of about 70 engineers across civil, geotechnics, bridges, civil structures, project controls, highways and rail that sit in the 2 offices. So I help lead that entire team on the West Coast, delivering a range of agency and private client projects and some really significant infrastructure projects for the like of Los Angeles World Airports, who operate LAX, and BART up in Northern California, the Bay Area Rapid Transit. So I'm currently responsible for winning work, making sure projects are delivered on time, and making sure we have the right resources and developing staff so that they can take on leadership roles as they move through their careers.
So how does Arup fit overall within the infrastructure industry?
Arup is a global firm, and across the world, first of all, we have significant influence in infrastructure as an industry. In parts of the world, we're heavily influential in things like rail, for instance. In Hong Kong in the early 1980s, we redefined the codes in terms of how high-rise buildings are developed and built more quickly and sustainably. So we have a large influence globally. In the Americas market, we are still a smaller firm, but we are heavily influential in some of the project types that we participate in. So if I look at what we're doing in Los Angeles now, we've just finished as lead designer the design and oversight of construction of the Gerald Desmond Bridge in the Port of Long Beach. This is a one-of-a-kind cable-stayed bridge that provides clearance and replacement actually to an aging bridge that was built in the 1950s that was starting to fail, and it provides enhanced clearance over the back channel for the next generation of container ships to come through the port. And that's a fantastic piece of infrastructure in its own right, but we were able to influence Caltrans as one part of the client entity there in the Port of Long Beach to change the foundation designs to use less concrete and to use a tip-grouted foundation. So whilst we deliver these big projects, we're looking at ways to more sustainably engineer the projects, make them more cost effective, but importantly, make them more inherently sustainable. And I think that's where we bring that kind of thinking to projects, try to bend the rule book as far as we can, push back on processes that are 40 or 50 years old and try to bring the new thinking. And we're able to do that by bringing in expertise around the world to support local projects. We use our Hong Kong office and our London office, for example, for the delivery of the Gerald Desmond Bridge. There was a long span bridge experience in Hong Kong that we're able to bring into any project locally. So I think that's where we can use our global experience to really influence the delivery and industry best practices for the market and the region that we're working in. And that's where I really see Arup at the forefront of large infrastructure projects.
So what are some unique challenges to designing and building infrastructure in LA and California?
If we zoom into the California market and LA, I mean, this is a state that's heavily regulated, as I'm sure you're aware. The energy codes, both at state level and at city level in Los Angeles, are extremely stringent. Water codes are, are very stringent and changing annually. The desire to be a progressive state in everything they do is now baked into the building codes here. So I think you're already pushed to doing a more thoughtful and integrated and sustainable design in a state like California than maybe in other states. I think it's fairly progressive. But there are challenges with that. The environmental process here to bring any project through to conceptual design often takes years because of the rigor in the environmental process and having to do alternatives analysis, vet out and prove an alignment of, say, a rail project is the optimum and it serves the communities it's intended to in the best way. So the early planning a project is really a long haul here, and that's perhaps something that the people that use the projects, use an airport, use a rail system, use the ports after the project's finished, don't probably appreciate the years of planning, community outreach and vetting that a project goes through just to get it through the environmental regulation here, so that the project is teed up to be as progressive and as sustainable and as useful and environmentally sound as it can be. And I think you can apply that to a project at the state level. It certainly applies in Los Angeles, where there are very stringent requirements for energy use, for sustainable water use on projects, and to minimize and manage stormwater runoff from projects. LA is a very progressive city in terms of low impact development and how we manage stormwater on projects. And clients and agencies are really pushing the envelope in terms of bringing in sustainable rating systems, LEED, Envision into the project requirements, so that you're actually forced to go beyond code in a lot of cases just to meet the criteria that agency clients are putting out there. So, I mean, it's really a great opportunity for engineers right now in a state like California, because it's really setting the standard that I think certainly the rest of the US will follow, and is being replicated in Western Europe right now as well.
Can you describe your favorite project you've led and why?
The first one is the LAX Central Utility Plant, or CUP, which Arup was the lead engineer on from 2010 to 2015. And this project put a new central plant in the heart of the LAX Central Terminal area, where the public interacts with the terminals in the fourth busiest airport in the world. This upgraded basically an energy inefficient plant built in the 50s and has set the airport up to expand its facilities, build out its capital program between now and 2040. This provides a sustainable source of energy. It uses cogeneration, so it uses the gas turbine generators to generate the electricity to run the plant itself, but also to generate the chilled and the hot water which the plant pushes out to the terminals for heating and cooling. So this was the first design build project that LAWA, Los Angeles World Airports, did in the heart of one of the busiest airports in the world. And from an engineering point of view, I led the civil engineering team. We had to work with our contractor client and the owner to phase and think about how you build 9 miles of utility systems that link the plant to all of the terminals in the middle of one of the busiest airports in the world without closing roads permanently. So packaging the project, minimizing the impact on the traveling public as far as possible, and delivering a project on budget that met the energy needs of the airport, but also sets the airport up to realize its capital program was extremely satisfying. And that plant came online in mid-2015 and is operating well. And then at the other end of the scale, a project we just completed last year that I was the project manager on was a green alley renovation project in a place called Pacoima in the San Fernando Valley. And this was a small pilot project put out by LA Sanitation, a department of the city, and two non-profit partners that Arup won as the lead designer. And through the course of that project, we were able to transform a pretty downtrodden, dark and gloomy alleyway, of which there's hundreds of these all over Los Angeles, and reimagine how an alley can function as a community space. So right at concept design, working with our landscape architect partner and our clients, we were able to bring the community in, listen to what they wanted out of the project, and implicitly drop that into the early design. And what we ended up with was a project that not just dealt with stormwater, which was the original remit, but created a shared space, which I think is the first in Los Angeles. So there's no sidewalk. We removed the sidewalk and we designed the alley so that it was safe for movement of cars, bikes, and people, and introduced low impact development stormwater systems such as planters and shade and vegetation and subsurface infiltration that dealt with the runoff but actually made the space safe to travel through. And then we coupled that with layering in community amenities for a performance space, exercise equipment, salvage timber, benches, and an outdoor classroom for education, and then it introduced lighting, so that space, which was used for trash collection and shady dealings after dark, is now front and center in that community as a multifunctional public space that people can move through safely. And that was a small project, but one that will live with me forever, I think.
So the next question is much more general, and maybe you could speak directly to our engineering audience. What are the most important issues facing engineers and why? And can you provide some advice on how these problems can be overcome?
I mean, I'll start with California in general. I think water is the biggest, is one of the world's biggest issues right now. The growing populations, the strain on our resources, access to water, particularly actually in many parts of the world which are seeing raises in temperature and a declining water supply. That is really something we have to get to grips with. And I think, in California, there's projects that have been conceived and are in the works. They don't move forward very quickly, but they're very complex. But I think as engineers, we can take cues on the water side, maybe from what Australia did in the 13-year drought. We can all maybe conceive that we can build lots of desalination plants. That's maybe one way to fix the problem. But is it energy? It's very energy intensive, and is that a sustainable solution? And I'm not so sure it is. So that's one way of dealing with water issues. But I think as engineers, we need to think about the knock-on effect. If we do build plants like that, what are the energy needs and where does that energy come from? Does that increase the fossil fuels that need to be burnt to do that? So trying to understand the interrelationships, particularly between energy and water, I think is a huge challenge. And I think in arid places, which are becoming more increasingly widespread throughout the world, utilizing or looking at water as a holistic resource, so that we don't just think about water we bring into our buildings and we drink as potable water, and then everything that goes when we flush a toilet or we use a sink, that goes and it's forgotten about and goes out to the ocean after being treated. Water is a single resource, and there are lots of opportunities to manage it much better, treat it and reuse it at all sorts of scales of development. There's great technology out there for treating wastewater and using it for things like irrigation, toilet flushing inside buildings. To me, it seems absurd that we, in a state like California, that we pay actually fairly small price for our water, but we are using highly treated water to flush toilets with in a state that hardly has any water. Why aren't we treating more grey water and black water and designing buildings and systems to use that treated water in order to safeguard our fresh water? And I think that's what we need to get to grips with over the next 50 years or so, as more and more of the world becomes warmer and populations increase. And I think there are tremendous opportunities to influence that, and for the engineering community to influence policymakers in making sure that water has to be thought about in a sustainable manner on every project that we engineer, whether it's a stormwater project, whether it's a new building that we can push the code beyond what's required to minimize potable water demand. So that would be my call to the engineering community.
How do you feel about the infrastructure industry overall? Meaning, can it help bring about needed change in the world? And are engineers responsible for leading such changes?
I think from my experience, certainly of working in the UK and now for the last decade or so in the US, there's been a neglect in infrastructure maintenance and asset maintenance. You think about in the US, we built the freeway system in the mid 1900s. The same in most of Europe. The rail systems and the highway systems are 50 to 100 years old. So they were built at significant effort, but there was very little funding to maintain the systems. And now we're in a situation in the US where our infrastructure is old, it's ailing. Our airports, by and large, are certainly out of date when you look at what East Asia is doing with some of the new development there. And there's been a lack of infrastructure investment, and that's now coming to the fore. And I think it's recognized with the forthcoming infrastructure bill. So I think there's that element that we can keep building stuff, but actually maintaining what we have and making sure what we design going forward can be multifunctional, and think about what a bridge or a highway might function as in 50 years' time as we make the transition to autonomous vehicles and other mode of transits. Thinking about how we design those pieces of infrastructure more flexibly so that they can evolve and be used, but also making sure there's an asset maintenance plan in place, because I don't think we can repeat what we did in the 1900s, where we built all this fantastic stuff, but there was never any money or maintenance on them. And then we get to a point where everything needs fixing at once. So I think as engineers, we can help our clients understand the longer or the life cycle of a project and help to put measures in place. One of the projects I've been personally involved with here is one of the freeway cap projects in Southern California. I think this is going to be a project type that we see all across North America in the next decade, where cities are looking at where freeways have segregated a city when they were built in the 50s or 60s, and that land is now at a premium. Many of these freeways, there's an opportunity to put a lid on them and convert them into public space, and that's a freeway cap. And there's a number of these conceived in the LA Basin right now in an early phase, and there's one that's complete in downtown Dallas in Texas, which is a public park. They built a lid over the freeway, basically built new real estate and have used it as a community space. So I think we need to start looking at our infrastructure and start to think about how it can function for the public benefit as well as for moving people in traditional means. And I think there's so much opportunity about repurposing freeways, looking at freeway caps. But when we conceive projects, informing our clients about how this project will function in 20, 30, 40 years, and how we design for evolving transit systems, the move to autonomous vehicles, and ultimately the creation of public space in and around them to encourage more active modes of transport. So I think we have a real opportunity here. I think we're in a changing world. So if we look at aviation as an example market, and the obviously the hit to that industry that's happened during COVID, as that sector reemerges, it's no longer acceptable to design an airport terminal or the passenger interface as we have done in the past. There needs to be, I think we need to think about people's health and safety in lieu of the pandemic, and how we can make things safer, these spaces safer for people to move through, how we can bring technology and touchless into rail stations, into airport terminals, because I think that the world has changed in the last 18 months. People are much more aware, and I look at my own kids actually, and they're so much more aware of sustainability issues, equality, how we interface with projects, how humans kind of interface with infrastructure, and we really need to think about how we take, you know, a traditional rail station, an airport terminal, whatever it is, and we make it as safe and as flexible and for the most part as touchless as possible as we emerge from this pandemic, when it's on everybody's minds. And that's going to be, I think we're going to be living with this for a while longer. And I think that is an opportunity, it's a challenge, but it's also a real opportunity to integrate some of the digital thought leadership that is out there in the industry. It sits within Arup as well, but there's a lot of good stuff that we now should be integrating much more into our projects to provide a much better experience for the user.